Joining me to discuss the role of energy in Australia's Energy Minister, Angus Taylor. Thank you for your time, Angus.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
I think there's something we can do here which you probably don't get much of a chance to do on, say, the ABC in that sort of gotcha world that you encounter there, and that's actually talk about some of the technical and economic background to the policy settings that you announced last week. First of all, let's deal with gas. Now, I think there's two questions here. One is a technical question, one is an economic question. Why is it that gas is such a good technical solution now to our energy requirements?
Well, Nick, before I answer that question fully, let me just say that what we're talking about here is having balance in our energy system. Any energy system needs balance. It needs a mix of different fuel sources that can give it the reliability and affordability you need. And that's always been true. It's true right across the world. No one fuel source is the full answer. Now, having said that, there's an enormous opportunity to get more gas into our energy and industrial systems. And let me explain the two parts to that. First of all, on the electricity side, gas is flexible and it's dispatchable. So flexible, you can turn it on and off very, very quickly, and dispatchable, it's there when you need it. The energy is stored in the gas, and it means you've got access to that energy when you need it, as fast as you need it. Now, that's enormously important when you have fluctuations in demand, as you have in our energy system all the time. When people turn on their air conditioning or turn off their air conditioning, or heaters for that matter, you've got enormous fluctuations in demand. You have to be able to adjust to that. But we've also increasingly got fluctuations in supply because of solar, and household solar in particular. Record levels of investment in household solar. Lots of your viewers will have solar on their roofs, and that means we've got fluctuations in supply we've got to adjust to. Now, many fuel sources, coal in particular, can't adjust nearly as well to this as gas, and gas can. So it's a very, very important fuel source. On the industrial side, it's often misunderstood that a large proportion of the gas that we produce is not used for electricity. It's actually used as an industrial feedstock for really critical products like fertilizer, plastics, and a range of other goods that are essential. Bricks, other building materials, they're absolutely essential to our lives. There are alternatives, but they're very, very expensive. So gas is great for manufacturing and industry. It's great for our energy system. We have great potential to get more of it into both our manufacturing and our energy system. But the key is to get it out of the ground and to make sure we've got an ample supply of it.
Yeah, I think the key to this, isn't it, is to understand that we're dealing with the energy problem we have now in 2020, not the energy problem that we had in 2010. And since then, of course, there's been a massive investment in renewables. I'm not sure that people always fully appreciate how big that is, because we're always being told by our critics that we're not doing enough on emissions. But it is massive, right? So in South Australia, for instance, I think they're second only to Denmark in terms of the amount of household solar per capita that they've put in. Now that's
we actually lead the world on this, and yet, I mean, to understand that, you just have to go into any suburb in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane in particular, and just look at the roofs, and you'll see them there. Now, as I say, it's almost becoming ubiquitous. Now, that's partly because there were heavy subsidies. They're coming off, and we're, as a federal government, not adding any new subsidies. In fact, we're seeing them all coming off because we think the economics there shouldn't be subsidies. But still, people are investing, and it's understandable. It's a way of them reducing their energy bills. There's an enormous amount of advertising. So 1 in 4 households now in Australia has household solar, highest in the world. We've got to have complements to that. And gas is a very powerful complement to solar. It works well in that environment. We've always needed flexible fuel sources, by the way, and there were many blackouts in Sydney and Melbourne in the 50s and 60s, and in fact, Snowy 1 solved much of that problem. So you need flexibility in your energy system as alongside the baseload power. We'll need coal in our system as baseload for many years to come, but you need that flexibility. We haven't had enough of it, particularly in some states, particularly in South Australia, indeed. And gas is a very, very good, affordable source of that flexibility.
Yeah, so let's get this clear. We claim to be energy source agnostic here. So if somebody came along to you tomorrow and said, look, I've got this fantastic plan for a new coal-fired power station that can, fill in some of this gap, and I've got finance for it, crucially, and I've got a state government backing it, you wouldn't say no to that, would you?
Sure. I mean, that's an interesting proposition. Obviously, subject to the costs, it's always going to be an interesting proposition. If they want to do it, go right ahead. I mean, the great challenge is finding a state government that would approve it. Getting finance, obviously, is a challenge as you laid out. But you also, the missing piece in our energy system at the moment is to have that flexibility. And that's why we need more gas generation. If Australia had the geography of Europe, you might say that there's more potential for a lot more hydro. We're doing some more hydro, but really, given our circumstances and our natural resource availability, that flexible dispatchable generation that we need so desperately is best achieved to a large degree by gas.
In the United States, of course, there's been a gas revolution with the technology of fracking, which has been introduced, and they've got, of course, very rich wet reserves, shale gas reserves there. Can we replicate that? Can we get to the position they are in the States at the moment, where the coal producers are just rolling over because gas is so much cheaper?
Well, you have seen a revolution in the United States, and it's in both the energy system and in manufacturing. And it has been driven by affordable supply of gas. There's no question about that. And Donald Trump has done well on the back of that. I mean, it's had a really significant impact pre-COVID on their manufacturing sector and on their energy system. And it has been gas driven. There's no question about that. Indeed, we've actually seen manufacturers shifting to the United States because of their affordable gas. Now, something remarkable has happened pre-COVID. It had already asserted itself back in January and February, and that's that Australian spot gas prices in the wholesale market have come into line with the United States. That is the first time we've seen that for many, many years. This is a very important development because it means we are now have access to an affordable source of gas at a market price, at an international price, which is extremely competitive. It's still hard to get longer term contracts, and many of the reforms we've announced in recent weeks have been about making sure that affordable gas that's available in the short term market becomes available over time for longer term contracts. But you can see the market is changing, and that's creating a great opportunity for Australia to take advantage of affordable gas.
So, 3 years ago when the Menzies Research Centre looked at the energy market, I think we got most things right, but we were saying at that point that there was an issue here because we were selling all our gas offshore at an international price, and we were not benefiting from any of that staying onshore at a local price. Now, that seems to be sorting itself out in the market, right?
There's no question it is. There's some things we can do to strengthen that development, but we're seeing it happening in front of our eyes, Nick. And part of the reason for this, a very important part of the reason for this, is the United States has become a very fast growing exporter of liquefied natural gas, of gas. Its first export from outside Alaska was in 2016. And in the last 3 years, it has crashed into the international market. It does mean the price in the United States is being set by the international price, but that's the international price we're also seeing. So relative to the United States, we are now in a very, very good position. It is a big change. It will take time for that to flow all the way through, but it means that affordable gas for our energy system to bring down the cost of electricity, or continue to bring it down. We're seeing really good movement on this now. And affordable gas for manufacturing is now a realistic prospect. And that challenge we had a few years back is dissipating. As I said, a number of reforms we're making to speed that along. but they're reforms that will speed along a natural market development that we already see in motion.
But at the end of the day, a shortage of supply of gas is always going to put pressure on prices, right? So we still have that in southeast Australia, in New South Wales and Victoria, where they've had moratorium in place, being lifted to various degrees in both states now. But that's created this shortage of gas in the southeast, which obviously is driving.
Let's be clear. It's a little more nuanced than that. So on the east coast of Australia, well, the west coast, we have massive excess of gas and we're a huge exporter. On the east coast, we have 3 times as much gas as we can use domestically, which is why we're a very significant exporter. Now, the truth is that much of that gas is coming out from Queensland. And Bass Strait, which was the traditional source of gas in the south, is running down. So it is true we're seeing more of a deficit emerging in the southern states, New South Wales and Victoria. That's why we want to see the moratoria gone in Victoria, and why we want to see Narrabri or other sources of gas in New South Wales coming forward, because we need southern gas as well as northern gas. We also need the capacity to transport gas from Queensland down into New South Wales to keep that price down, or New South Wales and Victoria. There is a pipeline to do it now, but it has to go all the way out to Moomba, so it has to go a long way west before it comes back into the east coast, the southeastern cities of Sydney and Melbourne. So there's a pipeline issue there. But, you know, the point here is, if we're smart about this, we can put downward pressure and ensure we have downward pressure on gas prices in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. And as I say, a number of those reforms we've announced in recent weeks are about achieving that. The interesting thing is we made some pipeline reforms a couple of years back, which means we're seeing a price in Sydney and Melbourne at the moment, which is pretty much in line with the Queensland price. That, again, is a very new development because we've made the pipeline, access to pipelines more competitive. So we're moving rapidly down the track of making sure this all works, and that we've got Australian gas working for Australians, and that's what we have to do. But the market is on our side and the wind is in our sails.
Now, we're both fans of the free market, of course. We're both liberals in the traditional sense of the word. We would love it if we could just throw this whole mess that the energy market is out of the free market and allow them to fix it, right? But that's not going to happen. I don't think we've ever believed that would happen without at least some judicious and strategic government intervention. Is that your view too?
Well, yeah, look, there's 2 fundamental problems. One is there have been very significant interventions in energy markets in the past. The Labor governments raised a massive renewable energy target at the federal level, and they're driving through very rapid renewable energy targets in Victoria, in the ACT and in Queensland, and they're distorting the market. So very significant distortions there. The second distortion is that the market share of the top 3 players in electricity retail and electricity wholesaling, generation in gas markets is very, very high. So small number of players with high market share. Economists call that an oligopoly. That's what we have in these energy markets. And so that again can cause distortions. If you lose a big slab of capacity like we did in Hazelwood in Victoria with coal-fired power station, the incentive for the existing big players in the market to replace that capacity is low. And so we have to make sure the market is working for customers, for consumers. That's the whole purpose of a market, so that consumers get a good outcome. In a perfect world, and in many markets, you just let it run and consumers are looked after. It's in the interest of suppliers to do that. But when you have very significant market distortions, you don't necessarily. And that's where we've had to make interventions, and we'll continue to have to make them. We make as little in the way of interventions as we possibly can. But this is an essential service. Energy is a utility for all Australians, as well as for critical manufacturing industries and other industries like transport and agriculture. And so we need a fair deal, and we need to make sure those distortions are not hurting customers.
One thing I think we need to deal with if we're going to unpack this issue, and that's the timing issue. I think a lot of people, they look at what we're reading on the future of nuclear and the 4th generation nuclear, and they think that's very good. People look at hydrogen. But I think the crucial point is here, although they are promising technologies, they're not ready yet, and certainly not on the time scale that we need, right? We've got an urgent issue here.
Look, there there are views out there that suggest that if you just announce some whiz-bang new project or technology, then suddenly the electricity price will collapse. It's just not true. The energy price will collapse. It's just not true. I mean, this is hard slog of getting more supply into the system whilst we make sure that other supply is not leaving the system and that our prices reflect a competitive market. That is hard slog. Now it's working. This is the point I'd make. In the last 12 months, we've seen wholesale electricity prices fall every month relative to the same time last year. It's a seasonal market, so you judge it against the same time in the previous year. Every month, we saw 4 consecutive quarters of CPI reductions in electricity prices. So that's a good start. We've got further to go. We've got to make sure those wholesale price reductions pass through to customers. But if we keep seeing supply coming in, avoiding large losses of supply, say a big electricity generator leaving the market, or states doing crazy things with moratoria on gas, we'll continue to see this downward pressure, and that then gives customers what they need, which is a fair deal, reliable, affordable energy, and gives manufacturers what they need, which is access to a supply of energy which is affordable and which they can trust, on the back of which they can make big investments.
And one part of your speech to the National Press Club last week, which I think didn't get much attention at all, was one of your key technology developments you talked about was the ability to measure carbon in soil and therefore to use farming in a much more effective way in terms of carbon mitigation. But of course that also has lots of other effects. Tell us about that.
Well, this is one of the 5 priority technologies where we said we want to put more research and development effort. And the great thing about soil carbon is, yes, we can store more carbon in our soil, but actually in the process of doing that to a sensible level, we can raise the productivity of agriculture in Australia. We've had an aspiration as a government of getting agriculture to be a $100 billion industry. We've been making good progress on that. But productivity of our soils and output of our pastures and crops is key to achieving that outcome. Now, it turns out, and it's sort of obvious when you think about it, when you grow more in your soil, you're producing more organic matter, which is carbon, and more carbon ends up staying in the soil. Yes, some of the carbon is taken off through harvest and through animals, sheep and cattle eating that grass, but some of it stays. And so if you can produce more from your land, you can store more carbon, and vice versa. Storing more carbon helps you to produce more. So it becomes this virtuous cycle. So there is a great opportunity to improve the productivity of our agriculture, store carbon while we're at it. What do we have to do that? Well, there's many different ways of increasing productivity on land. I mean, nutrients in soil is a very natural part of what farmers have done for many years, and there's new developments there. There's better pasture types, better seed types, and a range of other practices that have emerged using satellite technology to better understand how you should graze your country. All of these things are contributing to the opportunity for significant productivity gains, and in the process, increasing our soil carbon. Now, the great challenge with all of this is how to measure how much carbon you've got in your soil. We can do that now. We dig a big, deep hole, 1 metre deep, and pull out a core sample and go and get that tested at the lab. CSIRO has done unbelievable work in bringing down the cost of doing all of that. But there are other techniques for measuring soil carbon which are now becoming possible. Using satellite technology is one area where we think there's enormous potential. We want to get that cost right down so farmers know exactly where they sit, what their land is producing, doing and measuring that at very low cost, and in the process understanding better what practices are working and what aren't.
Yeah, so with the Menzies Research Centre, we're just finalising a report. I think we've spoken about it before on exactly this topic. And it seems to me that the key thing is a lot of good farmers are doing this already. A lot of smart farmers have realised that for a relatively small investment, you can considerably increase the productivity. Of course, water retention, which is important in the drought. But it seems to me they need to be rewarded for this too. If they're putting carbon in the soil, then they deserve to benefit from that, right?
Well, this is the point. There are many other things that we're now doing across the economy where people are being rewarded for reducing emissions. Indeed, the electricity grid, we've seen exactly that with schemes that have been put in place. But our emissions reduction fund has always been about creating a modest, not a huge incentive, but a really real and incentive for farmers and others to reduce emissions. The key with all of this is to be able to measure it, and that's why we're investing in the measurement technology so we can better ascertain how farmers are doing on this. And in the process of measuring it well, we're in a position then where we can pay them for the important role they're playing in doing all of this. So, we lead the world in this area. And there's a number of other technologies where we lead the world. And we shouldn't be surprised about that. Our farmers have led the world in so many areas for centuries now. We've been extraordinarily innovative, massive gains in labour productivity and the use of shearing machines, the stump jump plough, and many of the crop varieties that we've developed here in Australia, often through CSIRO over the years. This is another area where we know we can lead the world, and we should be doing that. It will be good for our agriculture, and it will also be good for bringing down emissions while we're at it. I love any opportunity that can do both of these things. We don't have to worry about the trade-offs then. We're encouraging sensible practices that are good for people's businesses and good for the country.
We might just go back briefly before we wrap up and look at the last election. One of the big issues, in fact, I think, possibly the decisive issue in that election was climate policy. Labor thought it was going to win with its very showy 35% emissions reduction target by 2050 or 2030. Sorry, but you argued, and I think with the help of the work that Dr. Brian Fisher did, and I think some of the work we did, that was crazy, and you won that argument essentially. And the proof is that Labor is now backed right away from that policy. They don't even have an emissions target for 2030, do they?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, look, the worst thing in the world in this area is to have a large target without a plan to get there, because what you then have to do is impose a whole lot of costs on people to achieve that target. Now, there's only two ways to reduce emissions. You use technologies in sensible ways where those technologies are coming into line with alternatives that don't impose economic costs, because it's just sensible for that business or that household to use the technology. And I mean, talking about some of those farming practices, deploying those farming practices is not going to make agriculture less competitive. It'll make it more competitive. So they're the sort of technologies that we want to deploy. The alternative, if you set very aggressive targets, is you've got to just start curbing activity, stopping activity to reach those targets. Now, that's effectively the target, the scale of the target that Labor had going into the last election. We know that their targets from the modelling Brian Fisher did would have cost 336,000 jobs across a range of different industries, slashed wages, slashed the economy, raised the price of electricity and gas for all Australians, and Labor weren't fessing up. Now, we made that apparent through Brian Fisher's work, and it was a very, very, very good piece of work in actually fleshing this out. Labor didn't have answers to any of the questions, and now, not surprisingly, they're backing away from the policy. The result is they have no 2030 target at all. They obviously have no plan to get there because there's no target in the first place. And they seem to be tearing each other apart on these issues. So, look, this all did begin at the last election, but the moral of the story is if you're going to have an emissions reduction target, make it a sensible one and make sure you can achieve it in ways that don't damage the economy, damage jobs, and raise the price of energy.
I'll close by just quoting to something the commentator wrote in one of the Fairfax papers at the weekend. I don't think naturally a supporter. He said that he was reflecting on the fact generally that under the Morrison government there seems to be a more consensual approach within the party and less hopefully there's always dispute and argument. We want that in a party, don't we? But let's hopefully there's a little bit less. But he said even in the quagmire of energy policy, nothing is quite the tinderbox that same-sex marriage used to be. Are you getting somewhere close to getting consensus within the party around these policies?
Well, I see. I think all Liberals, all on this, our side of politics, Nick, believe strongly in the power of progress and technology, what it gave us through the Industrial Revolution and since in terms of prosperity, opportunity, aspiration. I mean, we've harnessed technology to help us over the years. And what I'm proposing and what the government's proposing is that we should do the same to bring down emissions, but more importantly, or as importantly, to strengthen the competitiveness of critical industries, of our manufacturing industry, of our transport industry, of our agricultural sector in the process. And we can do that because we do lead the world in critical energy intensive technologies. We've been an exporter of energy intensive products for a long, long time. So we're extremely well positioned to do this. We should take advantage of it. And the result of that is we can all embrace it, whichever side, whichever part of the party you're from. This is good for the economy, good for aspiration, good for opportunity, good for competitiveness, and it aligns with the sort of values we really believe in.
Well, Angus, thank you for your time and thank you for bringing a bit of clarity to this often cloudy and opaque policy area. And congratulations on how you on your new policy.
Thank you. Thank you.